Steven,
Hi.
would you describe yourself as a composer and a person and tell a bit as who you are?
So I'm Stephen, as you know, Stephen Webb, and we've now been friends since I moved to Finland in 2017, where I did my master's at the Sibelius Academy, and my practice is kind of divided between composition and performance. The last couple of years, I've now been doing more with performance practice. Performances in live art and experimental theater. And I'm from the United States originally, from North Florida. And yeah, from there I moved to Chicago where I did my undergraduate studies, and I've been living in Finland ever since
What,
2017.
how did you choose to come to Finland?
Well, actually, when I was younger, I wanted to be an architect. Most of my life, I thought I would be an architect. So already from my early sort of 12, 13, I knew about Finland through architecture. And then when I was in high school, I went to an arts high school, and more and more somehow the Sibelius Academy as an institution was like talked about, people knew about it. Obviously many famous Finnish composers and conductors have built their careers in the United States, so it's something we associate with. So when I started my undergraduate studies, Sibelius Academy was somehow in the back of my mind. And then in 2016, I applied to do exchange studies, and it was basically between University of Sussex in Brighton or Melbourne in Australia or the Sibelius Academy. And my exchange coordinator in the States said to me, like, well, Brighton's the gay capital of Europe, wink, wink. And then I chose the Sibelius Academy, and he said, I can tell that you're a very responsible student. So it's kind of funny. But anyways, I came to Finland and liked it and then applied for my master's.
Fantastic. So you came to Finland and we met at some point. And how this piece started, and what was the idea, or do you remember at all? What was the
I do. Well, and maybe more context, because I think when the piece started, we weren't like yet, we were acquaintances, maybe more than friends. You had heard some of my music and you liked it.
Yeah, I remember I loved your piano vocal piece. It was fantastic, and originally maybe I asked to rearrange that for two guitars
Yeah.
or something like that. And
Yeah.
so please.
And so at that point, we were kind of like lunch friends. We would see each other on campus and have lunch. And at some point, you asked me, we had discussed the project that you just mentioned, and then you said that you had an idea because there's this culture and guitar music of setting folk songs, and this is seen vastly throughout guitar repertoire, and that there wasn't something similar with Finnish folk music. And so you pitched this idea of using Finnish folk music. And that kind of appealed to me because I'm very research-based in my music, and maybe even more than style or what the music kind of does musically, I'm interested in what is its kind of socio-political or cultural or ethnographic positioning, like using materials to make somehow comment on something. So I thought, okay, that opens up like a place for my brain to start mulling over an idea. And then originally, I did sort of do the idea. So I wanted to research folk music in Finland and try to pair folk songs that would create maybe some arc about the way they've been used in the cultural history, ways that they've been maybe politicized, or, I'm thinking about like the 60s folk music revival in the United States and how that was also a part of the civil rights movement and lots of things. So was there something comparable in Finland at any point of history? And I did make contact with the folk music department at SIBA and talked to many people, several professors, and like largely actually the sad thing that everyone says is that the folk music has been forgotten. So it was the opposite. There wasn't really anything to point to in a more modern historical context, in the last 60, 70 years, because actually that whole period is largely, it's diminished. Save for now the revival that's been created through the establishment of the folk department at the Sibelius Academy. So that kind of shifted the idea for the piece a bit. And then I just started trying to collect whatever folk tunes interested me.
One interesting point was that I don't know, did you stick with this idea or not? But because you come from United States and you have you had this big civil war, and it's big part of your culture. But in Finland, you mentioned when we were discussing that nobody speaks about our civil war. We only speak about the miracle of a winter war, talvisodan ihmeen. And then there's one part in this piece which is kind of like this war, and I cannot remember now. Did you say that it's the civil war thing in Finland or not? But it's for some reason it got stuck in my head, and always I'm feeling that this is this civil war that we had, and we are not talking about that. And I can say as a Finnish person that I cannot remember anything about civil war from the history classes or anything like that. So obviously we talk about that a tiny bit, but no, like that's only my touch with the civil war. So what's your opinion
What's
about
the truth?
What's
My
the
opinion
truth,
about
yeah.
it. Well, maybe in that sense, because of course as an outsider I have some objectivity in one sense, but it's also not my history to tell. It's my history to learn about and experience. So I think with all of the material, except for maybe one folk song, I felt I wouldn't say detached, but somehow like not wanting to impart too much of my own interpretation or opinion. And in fact, the war section, as you call it, is maybe like more largely about like social tensions or periods of unrest. The folk songs in that section actually come from these, well, I call them run melodies, but some of these Karjalan collected folk songs, mostly that were collected in the first part of the 20th century, which are archived online, which is also how the piece begins, just this succession of very simple folk tunes, which then get kind of stacked on top of each other contrapuntally. But you mentioned the Civil War and the United States and maybe my positioning as an American. And so the folk song that I found that I connected to or was interested in was the Pikkulintu. I originally discovered the song as a transcription at the Sibelius Academy Library by one Finnish composer, who I can't remember. Not a major name, not someone I immediately recognized. And then I went to try to find if there were any performances of this classical transcription, which I did not find, but I did find an American second-generation Finnish immigrant singing it for this Collected Folk Songs Archive project that was recorded, I believe, in the 30s. So it's this very nasal recording, and she's just kind of being interviewed, and then people, the guy who did this project, he would interview people around the United States, and then they would sing any folk songs that they carried with them. So in the recording, you can hear her say that she's from Oulu, and then she sings the song, and it's actually quite different than the one which was transcribed in the book I found at the Sibelius Library. It was quite a bit longer. There was even some strange grammar isms. It was a bit incorrect in a way, the Finnish grammar, so that was kind of interesting how this folk tradition was actually continuing on in the United States, and I felt somehow connected to that idea of diaspora, which is a huge part of Finnish history, actually. Like, there's history in Finland, and then there's large sects of Finnish people that settled in Brazil and the United States and other places. So that's also a kind of interesting side of it.
Would you describe how it's write for guitar? Is it difficult or?
I think it's quite challenging. It was my first time writing a piece for guitar, and maybe one critique or maybe not critique is the right word, but reflection I've had is that I stayed very comfortable with what I tried to do with the instrument. I wanted it to work and sound well. So maybe there was a bit of this contrapuntal studies, satsiopi, suomeksi, that led me to be a bit safe with it, which seems like it worked. You've said it's very comfortable to perform more or less, and it all works naturally for the guitar. But I think because it was my first guitar piece, I felt a bit hindered to get too experimental with what I wanted to do. That's one thing I've
Yeah,
reflected on.
Yeah, I remember that I played this piece for my teachers, and they said that this is well written for guitar. That is this composer a guitarist or something like that. So it was really well written for guitar. How would you describe yourself then composer and now yourself as a composer? Have you? You said earlier already that that you're doing a bit differently things.
Yeah. I think now well, when I wrote this piece, I was finishing up my studies at the academy, and I had settled into one kind of voice or style, and now I don't know that I've completely made the transition in my music, but I'm definitely starting to challenge myself and thinking, well, I don't want to continue exploring the same kind of way of thinking about making music. So I've been now, with each new piece, what is trying to make a vast left turn or right turn wherever life takes me. So I'm kind of figuring out that now. What will be the next kind of larger musical question when it comes to like my strictly musical practice? But yeah, as I mentioned, then there's also this sort of experimental theater, live art practice, which I've been doing more of in recent years, and creating projects which also blend my background as a composer and performance maker.
Fantastic. Well, maybe one more final question. Is there going to be pieces for guitar in the future?
I hope so. Well, I think we've already been discussing, like loosely, we have already discussed future collaborations. Now it's just, time goes, and I feel very happy to have projects on the books, but yeah, it's like finding the time and the right when everybody's
For
like,
sure, yeah.
But definitely, I think so. Good, yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.